New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about an extremely profound topic, the psychology of human survival, and in fact, explicitly, the psychology of the survival of the human race. My guest, Dr. Roger Walsh, is a psychiatrist and a professor at the University of California and also the author of a very interesting book called Staying Alive. Roger, welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. In your book, you look at the big problems facing humanity: global nuclear war, pollution, overpopulation, and you come to a very interesting conclusion. You suggest that all of these problems are man-made. They reflect our minds, our psyches, and that certainly one angle for resolving or for dealing with these problems then has to be psychological. What got you involved in these issues? So many people really don't want to face the big problems.
That's true, and it's really quite understandable. If you look at the magnitude and urgency and complexity of the problems we're up against, it's really no surprise that most of us feel pretty uncomfortable when we look at them. And yet, when we're brought face to face with them, it's really hard to keep the veils of denial and repression up. And for me, the veils were torn away when I went to Asia. I spent a couple of months there studying and doing research, and although I thought I knew about the state of the world, it was really quite a shock to me to find out firsthand just how most of the people in the world live, and to live with these people and just from day to day see the conditions which they were surviving under.
I had the experience myself this year. I've been to the Orient several times, and I can remember being in Shanghai, a city of some 14 million people, crowded. It's like the Beta Breakers race all the time.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
And the per capita income is something like less than the equivalent of $250 a year.
In fact,
for intelligent, well-bred individuals, it's horrifying in some ways.
That's true, and in fact 1 billion people live on an annual income of less than $200 a year on the planet at the moment.
It's hard for us to appreciate when we consider, less than $5,000 a year as poverty. I heard somebody say recently, if you're not making at least $100,000 a year, you're living in poverty.
Well, that's a very generous definition of poverty, and not something which most of the world's population would understand.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. So you were moved by your personal experiences of seeing this.
I was very moved by that. It really made me rethink. It made me realize I'd really been asleep about the state of the world. And then when I came back to the States, I started reading, and it didn't take more than a few days of reading about the global situation for me to appreciate that I just had not understood what we're up against. And to let some of those facts in was mind-boggling. And then I saw the film that the Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Nobel Prize-winning group, put out called The Last Epidemic on the Medical Consequences of Nuclear War. And that was another eye-opener. Again, I realized I'd just been asleep. I'd just been ignoring the greatest issues of our time. And then it was very hard to stay asleep.
There are some optimists, perhaps people in the current administration, who would argue that what's really going on in the world now is a redistribution of wealth because of the forces of the free market, which is why we're buying Japanese and Korean automobiles, so that those workers there, because of their poverty, can compete more effectively in the workplace, in the labor market.
Well, to some slight extent that's true. There is some redistribution going on in that way, but unfortunately the facts are very clear, and that is that the gap between the wealthy, the haves of the world, the wealthy nations, and the have-nots is growing, so that the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer to some extent, and in part that reflects many of the other problems we're facing, such as population explosion. Most of the population explosion is occurring in third world countries which can ill afford it. Starvation, of course, is occurring in these countries. We lose 20 million people a year of starvation, 50,000 a day. That's extraordinary. And so this idea of that things are kind of correcting themselves is not true. It can be corrected. Yeah. I think that we have to appreciate that we do have the power, we have the technology, the resources, the information to correct the problem, to handle the global threats. But it's a question of whether we're willing to really make that our priority.
I think the most striking statistic, and in your book you cite many statistics, the one that really got to me the most was the notion that we spend, as I think you said, worldwide some $660 billion on armaments and the arms race and the military, and maybe 1% of that would be sufficient to end world starvation.
You know, those figures are extraordinary, and the tragedy is, Jeff, that those figures are a couple of years out of date now. This year, for the first time, the world will spend over $1 trillion on weapons. $1 trillion, that's $3 billion a day. You know, if you spent $1 million a day since the birth of Christ, you wouldn't have gotten through more than about 2/3 of $1 trillion. That's how much it is. And if you compare that with the amount needed to eradicate world starvation, which has been estimated by the Presidential Commission on World Hunger at about $6 billion a year, that's a lot of money. But it's less than 1%, as you said, of the world's arms expenditure. So 1 year of the world's arms expenditure would eradicate starvation for 150 years.
It makes me angry at us when I hear you say that. It's like there's something in our minds collectively where we have agreed that, I think as you put it in the book, we can't afford to feed the starving and we can't afford not to build up these arms. Honestly, Roger, it makes me angry to think that this is what we collectively believe.
Well, that's probably a very healthy response, because the state of the world is almost one of insanity, and we have to really appreciate that before we can start working effectively. Because, as you pointed out in the introduction, for the first time in human history, each and every one of the threats we're facing to human survival, whether it be nuclear weapons or overpopulation or starvation or degradation of our environment, each and every one of these is human-caused, which means it stems from our behavior, from our ways of thinking and acting and perceiving, and is ultimately traceable to the psychological forces within us and between us. And what that means is that what we've called our global problems are actually symptoms. They're symptoms of the distorted ways we look and perceive and think and believe and act. And unless we appreciate that, we're only going to treat symptoms. And the way most of us treated or tried to treat global situations is with the military, economically or politically. And it hasn't gotten us too far. Of course, those are absolutely essential. But unless we recognize that the state of the world is a reflection of the state of our minds and try to heal our perception, to see more clearly, to reduce our fear and paranoia, and to correct our beliefs, to get correct information, we're not going to get it handled.
You know, I had a discussion with a spiritual teacher, Idris Shah, Sufi master, about this issue. It was over 10 years ago. And I said to him, you know, at this point we have to wake up, we have to become enlightened, we have to change. It's a matter of survival. And he said, yes, that's absolutely true, but if you put it to people that way, it won't work. You can't, that's not the reason that people are going to wake up.
What was his suggestion as to why people would?
Well, I don't listen to Sufi stories. I don't know quite what he had in mind there.
Well, I'm a little more
You're
pragmatic.
putting it more directly, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I think it's very possible that the situation might evoke from us more mature responses. You know, there are two things that could happen out of this, because these threats have very strong effects on us. I mean, we can deny and repress all we want, but there's no way we can escape completely the effects of the fact that our lives hang by a thread and we have no guarantee that any of us or our culture or our friends or our loved ones are going to be here tomorrow. That has major effects. And what that means is we could go two ways. On the one hand, we could, the very threats we've created could exacerbate the fear and paranoia and defensiveness that got us here in the first place. Or on the other hand, if a sufficient number of us are really willing to face these honestly and act appropriately, then we might be able to reverse the situation and even perhaps learn and grow in the process. Because it's going to take more than we've had before. It's going to take new levels of individual and collective responsibility and maturity and growth and collective action. And so it's just possible that the very threats we've created might act as catalysts to pull us out of the situation. That's our hope, I think.
That's the optimistic view.
That's the optimistic view.
As in a Shakespearean tragedy, it will bring out the noblest.
Yeah. And of course the reality is we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know that we're going to survive. We have no guarantees whatsoever, but it doesn't seem to be much sense to do anything except work like hell to ensure that we do.
You know, what you have done, and I certainly want to go into this in some detail, is you've analyzed the situation psychologically using the various schools of psychology and what they can offer, from behaviorism all the way to transpersonal and the spiritual aspects of psychology. And yet there are those who suggest that the problem isn't really psychological quite, or they suggest what we really have to come to terms with is the problem of evil itself. How do you address that?
Well, I think we need to take a real close look at what we mean by evil. And you can look at unskillful behavior which causes incredible suffering to people, either in terms of evil and malevolence, or you can look at it in terms of it being an expression of people's mistaken beliefs and fears and paranoia. And it's very interesting, what comes up for you when you hear the words evil?
Well, one thinks of, the religious mythologies and Satan, or the notion of absolute evil, battled, locked, like day and night. And
that's it. And when there's evil, then the automatic response is to attack and defend and feel very righteous about it. So what I'd suggest is that seeing people acting in terms of evil is very dangerous, because one of the sad facts of human nature is that we tend to become what we believe our enemies are, and to justify our actions in terms of theirs. So if we see them as evil, then we're likely to respond appropriately in the same way.
Well, the
ourselves.
classical example of this would be the Inquisition, where the church tortured and killed 10 million people in the name of Jesus, and because they were evil.
Yeah, for their own good, for the good of their souls.
And yet this notion of evil, which you seem to be challenging in a very intelligent fashion, is embodied in most of the major religious traditions today.
It is at some levels, and yet some of the more sophisticated religious teachings tend to see unskillful behavior more in terms of an expression of people's fear and defensiveness, and try to heal that rather than trying to attack and destroy the person who has it.
So one of the things that you're saying is that our tendency to label the problems that we're having as resulting from evil in the world, that in itself is an illustration of part of the problem from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, and a very tricky one too, because we can feel so righteous when we're battling evil. We're on the side of light. And it's always interesting, if you look over history, everyone always thinks they're on the side of the light and angels, and no one's ever kind of fighting for the devil.
And of course, then there's the classic statement of Reagan, of the focus of evil in the modern world then becomes the Soviet Union, and it has this almost religious aura, like we're getting ready for a holy war here. Well,
of course, that's a real danger. Whenever throughout history people have seen the, quotes, enemy as entirely evil, then that, there's been the tendency to engage in battle, to attack them.
And another level here, mythologically speaking, may be in the Bible itself, the myth of Armageddon, that we're moving towards this gigantic nuclear war, and it's God's will.
Yeah, it's a very tricky belief. And I think you're pointing to something very important here. You're really pointing to the beliefs that may be operating in the culture which may pull us towards mass suicide, particularly when those beliefs aren't recognized as only myths or only beliefs. And when we either don't recognize these myths are operating in us, or we just assume automatically that they're the truth, then they have power over us. So one of the crucial issues, I think, what's really facing us here is firstly to recognize the power of myths and beliefs, and then to recognize the beliefs that we hold, and to recognize that they're just beliefs, that they are statements about reality which we tend to take for reality.
You cite the statistics of children, though. Young children today, school children, what, 80–90% of whom anticipate a nuclear war now in their lifetime.
There are a large percentage of kids who fear that.
I may have overstated it, but it's high.
Yeah, it's high. It's very high, yeah. And that's a very scary fact, because if these kids don't have any reason to think they're going to live out their life, then it leads to a sense of hopelessness, depression, despair, and quite possibly an exacerbation of feelings of aggression towards society and so forth. It's a very dangerous situation we're facing.
You see it reflected in the young countercultures now, the punk movement, the new wave movement. They've changed from the days of the hippies.
Well, the younger generation always keeps reacting against the older, so I'm not sure we can blame it entirely on the nuclear situation. But there's no question that the global threats have embedded themselves deep in the minds of all people, young and old, American and Soviet, and are having their impact. And the question is whether we can face these facts, open ourselves to them, look at them honestly, and out of that honest looking, kind of allow ourselves to be touched by them. And to the extent we're touched by the enormity of preventable suffering in the world and the possibility of this useless mass killing, to that extent we're likely to react with compassion and concern and contribution. So it's, the ancient wisdom was the truth will set you free, and that's not only good theology, it's very profound psychology as well. So one of the first things we have to do is just keep looking truthfully at the situation we've created.
And to start out with, I guess what you're saying is to recognize the severity of the problem.
Recognize the severity of the problem, and also recognize the extent to which it's a creation of our own minds and our own beliefs and our own misperceptions, and then start working on those.
I suppose for the sake of clarification, we might start, I think, the big ones must be population, pollution, nuclear war, starvation.
Indeed, those are those are the big ones we're facing.
The big four, have I missed any?
Well, that covers covers a lot. There are others, of course, the climate changes and carbon dioxide increase, but we don't have to list ad nauseum. The message is very simple. We've got lots of problems, and they're solvable if enough of us are willing to take responsibility and start acting. And one of the things that's really crucial here, I think, is for us to appreciate that these problems are solvable. Not only are they solvable, but that each of us can make a useful contribution here. And one of the problems that so many of us have is the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, and what the heck can I do? I mean, I don't have the facts, or I don't know enough, or I'm too this, or I'm too that. And there's a wonderful quote by Henry Ford, which I love, and Henry Ford said, "Those who believe they can do something and those who believe they can't are both right." And I think that's a pretty potent statement. It really is a message of hope and of empowerment for all of us to appreciate that if we believe we can make a contribution, we can.
And that's exactly what you're doing.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do now, and many people watching will be doing as well.
Right. So let's now begin to outline some of the major areas where you see a psychological dynamic that we can focus in on. For example, behaviorism is a school of psychology that seems to be saying quite a lot about these problems.
Well, each school says quite a bit. Behaviorism, for example, emphasizes the role of rewards and reinforces, and also the role of modeling. That is the people who are put up to us as role models. And for example, now if we want to look at the role of the media here, which is incredibly powerful, then who are the stars? What is presented to us on TV, and we find that the heroes of Western television tend to be rewarded for being aggressive and highly consumptive, using a lot of raw materials and so forth, exactly the things which are creating us problems.
Well, there's a kind of a cycle there, because the major networks believe that they have to put this on in order to get market share. And so a lot of people must believe that that's what they want to see.
Well, it's as long as those examples are provided to us of what's successful and what makes people happy, as long as the media keeps fostering that illusion, then for sure that is what people will tend to watch. I think we really need a new generation of heroes. You know, John Wayne is not going to keep us on this planet.
But we do have Bill Cosby.
We have Bill Cosby, right? Yeah, maybe hope yet. Yeah.
So what you're saying as regards to behaviorism, we need to provide positive models.
Yeah, we need positive models, particularly given the power of the media and the fact that, you know, an average kid spends more time in front of TV than in front of a teacher. Yeah. So we really need this, and we need to be aware of what we're reinforcing people. For example, we reinforce our politicians for supplying unlimited amounts of raw materials, for example, gasoline, right now, even though it may mean that our kids face a very drastic situation with...
Nobody thinks in the long term. I mean, we think about oil glut. 5 years ago, we were thinking otherwise.
And
5 years from now, who knows?
5 years from now, again, yeah. We don't reward our politicians for that type of long-term thinking.
In fact, just the opposite. The system seems to have short-term rewards built in. This is the teaching of the behaviorists, that the closer the reinforcement or the reward follows the behavior, the more people recognize it. So built into the very nature of the human organism is short-sightedness.
That's true, and so we need to do things to make us more aware of the long-term consequences. And for example, one example of that that's now institutionalized is the necessity of environmental impact reports, which make it clear to everyone what exactly the long-term impact of major institutional changes is going to be. So that's one example of what can be done.
But what in effect we're doing, as I see it, is we're kind of telescoping. We're taking a long-term impact, which might be a reinforcer of some kind, and we're saying, okay, you've got to have this report ready next month. So we're making it into a short term by requiring the environmental impact report be done.
Well, we're making ourselves aware right now of the impact.
Are you saying that awareness is enough? That if we're aware of the fact that we only look towards short-term reinforcements, that will actually change?
Well, awareness is healing. There's no question about that. I'm not sure it's enough by itself.
The behaviorists would probably not say so, I would think.
Right, exactly. Some other schools might, but I don't think anyone would argue with the idea that awareness is crucial to healing both the individual, the culture, and the planet.
And it may be our best point of leverage.
It may indeed, yeah. It may be that's one of the best things any of us can do, I think, is to educate ourselves, to educate other people, just to know the facts. Because that once we know the facts, that tends to evoke appropriate responses. So we just the first step is always education. H.G. Wells said it very well. He said, human history is becoming more and more a race between education and catastrophe. And that's very true now, more true than when he said it.
And if we were to look at education today in a kind of its optimal sense, what I think we'd be needing to do is to give people a whole perspective of what's really happening in the largest possible sense.
That's right. We really would need to be giving more courses about the global situation, the whole planet, the state of our world. There are very few courses like that in colleges or schools at the moment, but they're getting more, and that's very hopeful that the education is beginning to shift. I see it in the University of California where I work, and I feel encouraged by that.
Now, as a psychiatrist, what about our understanding of the unconscious dynamics of the mind? You know, Freud, I think, seemed rather hopeless about the human situation because he saw all this muck, aggression, libido, and so on going on in the unconscious. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, Freud was a little bit of a pessimist about the human condition. I'm not sure I'd want to agree completely with that. I think the reality is all of us have the potential for positive and negative, and we react according to circumstances, environment, upbringing, etc. So we're a lot more malleable, changeable than perhaps Freud would have wanted to believe. So that gives me more hope. But clearly unconscious factors play a large role. For example, the role of fear operates unconsciously, and we respond to our fears by what we call defense mechanisms, whereby we, for example, repress and deny our awareness of the situation, or we project onto other people those parts of ourselves and those motives we're unwilling to recognize and acknowledge in ourselves. So then, for example, we turn out to be lily white and they turn out to be evil and malevolent and bad and vicious and all the things that we're not. And that kind of...
How do we put a stop to that?
Well, knowing about these processes is very helpful, first off. Once you know that all of us tend to project, that all of us tend to repress and deny a bit. No one's perfect. There aren't any, at least I haven't met any perfect human beings, and I've been looking for some time. So all of us do these, and once you know that, then it gets very, very hard to deny that that these forces are operating between nations and between leaders as well as between you and I, for example.
In other words, when we label someone as an enemy, we make them all bad, and we think of ourselves as all good. And the truth of the matter, I suppose, is that our enemies aren't as bad as we think they are, and we're not as good as we think we are.
Well, the truth often tends to be somewhere in the middle there, And the interesting thing, of course, is that we look out and we see our enemies, for example, the Soviets, as evil and bad and wicked, and they look at us and see us exactly the same way. So there's something very interesting going on there, that there's this mirror image that we hold of each other.
What do we do about that?
Well, again, I think you pointed to one of the things, that's information.
Yeah.
Just letting inaccurate information. For a long time, it wasn't even allowed to teach or talk about communism openly in this country for a while. And of course, the Soviets don't do a tremendous amount of censoring. So letting accurate information in is one thing. Getting people in contact is another. Just allowing greater contact. And one of the interesting developments is this movement of citizen summitry, with people going across to the Soviet Union, inviting Soviets here, getting to know one another firsthand. That clearly breaks down some of the stereotypes.
What do the spiritual psychologies, if you can tell us in about a minute, have to say about these issues? Perhaps we can conclude on that note.
Well, let's see. I think the spiritual psychologies would point, some of the Eastern psychologies would point to the role, for example, of greed or addiction and hatred and anger, and of what they call delusion, that is, not seeing clearly, the appreciation that our mistaken beliefs and defenses distort our perception of one another and of other nations.
In other words, by not being in touch with our deepest, truest self, we're acting out of false values.
That puts it very nicely. Yeah, that's good. That's very good.
Well, Roger, the sense that I have from being with you is that if just by being able to discuss these things and maybe share them with other people, as we're doing now, that's a step in the right direction.
I certainly hope so.
And that's something that everybody can do.
Absolutely everyone, yes.
And perhaps it's something that will continue to grow and snowball. Well,
I hope so.
Roger, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you very much for being with us also.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.